This lesson is going to be a demonstration of how we can use JavaScript objects and output the content of the JavaScript object onto our web page. So what we're using is the document object, and this is an object as well that gets generated by the browser, and it can be accessed using JavaScript, and that gives us the ability to interact, update the contents of the web page, so even manipulate it. So if you were to type in the document, you would see that it returns back in the console the entire web page and all the contents of it. So it's a virtual representation of the HTML code, and then JavaScript can interact with this object, update and manipulate the data, and also create event listeners. So we're selecting the two page elements. So we've got output 1 and output 2. So those are going to give us containers on the page that we can output some content. We're going to construct an object, a fairly complex object that has an array. It has strings, numbers, as well as booleans. And then we're also going to work with some smaller objects, and using the values contained within those objects, we're going to output them on the page. Also discuss the benefits of using the bracket notation as opposed to the dot notation to select the values from the object. This lesson we're going to be looking at JavaScript objects. So we're using the index.html file, created a brand new app3.js. So this is where our JavaScript will go, and this is going to be where we're going to be presenting the JavaScript for this lesson. So creating a div, I'm going to assign a class of output. So this will give us a container where we can output some content to from JavaScript, from our JavaScript code. And this is also in preparation to learn more about what's possible with AJAX. I'm going to stop the live server, and I'm going to reopen the live server. So we've got the example of the web page on the right-hand side, the code on the left-hand side that's being written within the code editor. I'm also going to be opening up the DevTools, so using the inspect, that will pop open the DevTools console, so that also allows us to interact and see the output from the JavaScript. So first off, what we want to do is select the element, and I'll just give it a variable name of output, and using the document query selector, selecting the element with a class of output. So this will give us a container where we can update content in, and with JavaScript, in order to update content that's within an element, we can simply assign text content into it. And as we see that, the page will dynamically update that. So this isn't within the HTML, it's done with JavaScript. And this is going to be part of the AJAX process where we're loading the code in the background using JavaScript, and then lastly outputting it on the page using the document object model, which is the browser's representation of the HTML code. And that's where JavaScript can come in and make updates to that content. So we don't actually want to put hello there, so this was just a demonstration. So I'm going to comment that out within the JavaScript code. So we do want to create an object, and just going to call it actually my object. So give it a variable name, and you can use const. As with objects in JavaScript, objects are referencing a memory location, and that's why when we are writing JavaScript, if we're connecting to an object such as one of the ones on the elements within the web page, we can also update it, manipulate it, even though we're declaring it using the keyword const. So that indicates that it's not supposed to change, but although as long as we're still referencing that object, we can manipulate the items contained within the object, and it's still going to be referencing that same object. We can reference that same object from multiple variables within the JavaScript page. So just to demonstrate that as well, so create a variable called div, and then using the document query selector, selecting the element div, so we only have one on the page. So we're selecting that, and if we update the content of div1, so if we'd update the text content of it to say hello div and save that, we're going to get the output of hello div, but it's still referencing that same output area. So if we do reference that element, it's going to reference that same one that just got updated. So they're both referencing the same object, and that's because it's referencing the memory location that's stored within the document object. So creating an object in JavaScript, so we use the curly brackets, and with the object itself, we can contain multiple values within this object. So if we had a list of friends, so this is going to be an array, and using the colon, so we've got the value on the right-hand side and the name of the property on the left-hand side. So this gives us an opportunity to have an array, and the array as well can contain multiple objects. So if we had objects in this type of structure, we can output them. And let's populate some content within the object. So right now we just have the one property value of the first, and we can add in as many as we want later on. So as long as we're still using the same key, it's going to make it easy as we go through the array to select the object information. And I'm just going to change the names here and save it. So now when we reference the my object, we can see that within the my object we've got an array, a friends array, and that friends array has multiple items contained within the object. And I'll give you some more examples of objects. So creating another object. And so this object, because we are using the double quotes, this is also going to be formatted for JSON. So this is also valid JSON format. And for the application, once it's in JavaScript, you can use either a JavaScript object or a JSON formatted one. It'll read it the same way. And this is in preparation where we're going to pull in the JSON data. So it's all about the named pair values. So we create within an object using the curly brackets, and then we can list out the various names. So if in, like we had within the first example, where we've got a name, and so this is just going to be the one item within the objects. So these are all going to be related values to that first item. So that way, this is also an object, but it's only going to have the one object within it. And this is an example above where we have an object that contains an array that contains multiple objects within it. And the benefit of having it with the array within the objects is you can also apply different values in there as well on the root of it. So we can have all the friends listed out. And you can also have another one for my data, or so we could just have my name. And so this can just be referencing a string value. And then we can have total. So this can be an integer and a Boolean value as well. So this is case sensitive, so make sure that you're using it all lowercase. And this again is going to be valid within the JSON. So here we've got an example of an array, a string, an integer, as well as a Boolean value. And all you have to do is comma separate them. So just as we see down here where we've got first and last, this is going to be the same idea, except we're, instead of having a string, a Boolean, or an integer, we have an array here. And then this array happens to have a bunch of objects within them as items within the array. So what we want to do, once we've got it within a JavaScript object format, that means that we can make use of it on our web page. So I'm going to create a second output area, and I'll call this output 1, output 2. I'll update the code accordingly. And I'm going to comment out this part because we don't need it anymore. And we're going to select them as usable variables within the JavaScript. So that way we can reference them using the one variable name. So if we want to output some of the content that we have within one of these objects onto the page, we can update the inner text, the inner HTML, and there's a number of ways to output the content. So we select the container element and set the text content property of that container element. So first let's use the my object 1. So how would I output the first and last name of the contents of my object? So you reference the main object name, which is my object 1. And I'm going to use the square bracket in this example. And I also have an option to use the dot notation, so I'll show you that one as well. And then because this is a string, we're concatenating it together. So I'm going to just add in a space there. And then to get the second item with the key of last, we can reference it within the bracket notation as well. And just save that. I'm going to set the view to word wrap so that we can see the entire statement on the page. So now our output 1 element has updated, and we're getting the content that's coming from this JavaScript object, which is the contents of the myObject1. So let's update that second element. So we've got output 2 as well. And this time we're going to use the syntax with the dot notation. And there are some limitations to the dot notation as well as some benefits to the bracket notation. So whichever one you choose to do, I'll give you some more examples of this coming up. So now we've got the output 2 text content. And I'll show you how this works with the dot notation, and then as well for the last. So make sure there's no spaces there, and we don't need any of the quotes around there. So that outputs that same content, and if we make any changes to it, that will change as well within the output of both of them. So if we wanted to see what the difference between the bracket notation and the dot notation, so the bracket notation is much more dynamic and also allows us to have objects with that have spaces within the names. So for instance, if we had something like first name, last name, and we'll just give this a name of object2. And now if we go to output the contents using the key names, notice that there's a space in there. So that's not going to work well with the dot notation. And I'll just log these out into the console. So we can get the contents of myObject2, but using the bracket notation, we can get the first name, which works. But what happens if we try to use the dot notation? And you'll see that that's going to throw an error because we can't handle the spaces within the object name. So it's going to throw an error because it doesn't understand how to manage the spaces. It's looking for an object with myObject2 dot first, and it's not managing the spaces. So if you do have spaces within the object name, then you should be using the bracket notation. And JSON does support this type of structure as well. You're going to see that when we do have this type of the property names, you also use this camel case. So that allows us to use the last name within the dot notation. And so that will work this way. The other thing with the bracket notation, we can also have more of a dynamic selection of that because all it expects is within a string value here. So if, for instance, we have a variable, and this variable happens to be first name, we can use the variable string as what we want to select from the object. So using the object again, and we'll just try the same example and show you the difference between the dot notation and the bracket notation. So here for object2, we can reference it as a string and just using the value. But if we try to do it with the dot notation, it's going to throw an error. Or it's not going to be able to find the value, and it's going to be returned back undefined because there's no value that's according to this name because we've got the space in there. So if you do, are you using a dynamic way to select the value? The bracket notation does accept string values, which is a definite benefit when we're trying to access, and maybe we've updated this dynamically within the code, and that it still allows us to output it using the string. So these are just some examples of how you can use the JavaScript and JavaScript objects and output the contents on the page using the bracket notation or the dot notation. So try it out and output, create some page elements, select them within the JavaScript code, create some objects to output the contents of the objects onto the page using both the bracket notation and the dot notation. Use one of the more complex objects such as the myObject and select and output some content from there as well onto the page. So let's update and take output 1. And I'm going to just set the text content of output 1. And this time I'm going to use the myObject. And we're going to navigate down all the way to the word John. So within the myObject, we've got the property name is friends. So we can use the bracket notation in order to select friends. And then what we want to select the first friend. So this is an array. So selecting the first friend within the friends array. And this is going to still come back as an object. So within the friends array, we're selecting the first friend. Actually, we want to select the one with index value of 2. And then the property from the friend is going to be first that we want to return back. And I'll walk through how I'm making this selection. So that outputs the name John that's coming from this more complex object. In addition, one of the ways that I usually traverse a more complex object, and you can do this as well within your browser. So if you have the object, you can list it out, and then from here you can get all of the values and the property names of the values that are contained within the object. So I know if I select the my object, if I want the my name value, I can output that. If I select the my object and if I select friends, that's going to return back an array. And just like with any array, we can use the index in order to get the particular object item that we want from the array. And in this case, we can select the first one and then returning back via the property name of first, and it's going to return back the name Mike. And that's where, if we want to return back the third item, which has an index value of 2, and getting the property name of first, we can return that back, and that's where we get John. So that's going to correspond with what we're doing for the output and outputting it onto the page, coming for this more complex object. And it is important to get more familiar with these complex objects because a lot of JSON data is going to be coming in a more complex format and structure, and it will challenge you to navigate down and select the proper values that you want to work with and output to your page.